We felt we were living outside of history. In other words, that story that we told about Jewish history, that was what happened to those people there. It wasn't what we were trans-historical. We were beyond history. Jewish history and its patterns for 2,000 years didn't touch us. American Jews are struggling with the fact that history came knocking at the door after all. That the history of American Jews is now looking like very much the history of Jews.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. America was supposed to be different. A new world, free from the shackles of Jewish history, free from the anti-Semitism, the pogroms, the persecution that had plagued and ultimately destroyed Jewish life in Europe. But history is back, and it's back with a vengeance. Anti-Semitism is back, and with it, fateful questions about how to keep Jewish communities safe and, you know what being a Jew in America even means. For this episode, I sit down with a man who knows the struggle of American Jewry as well as anyone. Dr. Daniel Gordis is an American-born Israeli author and ordained rabbi, a man of conviction who recently stormed out of the conservative movement's rabbinical assembly in protest at the anti-Israel sentiment that he heard within its ranks. Daniel takes us through internal debates and dilemmas of American Jewry, the questions they are asking about their future, and the questions they should be asking about a future marked by growing disquiet from its youth looking to uncouple their Judaism from Israel, but also by a growing tide of Gen Zionists who are reconnecting with Israel in solidarity with their global Jewish family under attack. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Dr. Daniel Gordis, welcome to State of a Nation.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
On this podcast, we usually discuss the strategic dilemmas facing Israel, the impossible predicament it finds itself in. But with you today, I want to discuss the strategic dilemmas facing the other half of the Jewish world in the diaspora, particularly in the United States, where, especially in the wake of October 7th, but not only, Jews find themselves facing major questions about who they are, what they are, how they keep themselves safe as a community. And that question is really going to come to crunch time in November with the presidential election, presumably between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. I've heard anecdotally from a number of left-wing, left-leaning progressive Jews after October 7th that they've had it with the Democrat Party, with the way that progressives have turned on Israel, and they're willing to do the unthinkable and actually vote for Donald Trump. Unthinkable for them. Specifically in November, what are the major dilemmas facing American Jews as they have, for the first time since October 7th, to cast a ballot on how they see their future as a community?
Well, I've heard similar anecdotal stories as well, by the way. I've heard of some people who are very much on the left who would never have contemplated voting for Donald Trump saying the only way Israel's going to be able to win in Lebanon is with foreign troops. I'm not advocating that position. I'm saying that's what they say. Israel's not going to be able to do it on its own. Joe Biden is never going to send American troops onto Lebanese soil. Donald Trump might do that because who knows what he would do about almost anything. So I've heard people say, yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump just because Israel can't do this alone. Biden administration has been supportive in some ways, not supportive in other ways, but we've got to go much further. Look, the choice that American Jews are going to face in November is a brutally difficult choice. I mean, first of all, the question is whether you're a one issue voter or not a one issue voter. Because American Jews should care about America in general. My own view is that the potential damage to America's democracy, judicial system, a whole array of systems posed by a second Trump administration that does not have to worry about a third Trump administration unless there's no more elections, in which case it doesn't really matter either way. There's a lot of worry among American people in the center and to the left, not hard left, about what the Trump administration would mean for democracy in America, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. If you're an American Jew and you're voting as an American, that's obviously something you have to consider. But let's just leave that all aside and talk about what this means for Israel. For American Jews who care about Israel, I think we have to understand the following. This is not universally accepted, but I believe this very strongly. That Joe Biden is the first genuinely Zionist president the United States has ever had.
That's a very bold statement.
I think that I don't know if it's because if it's because I'm saying that he is or because he's the first.
Well, it's because you're saying he's the first. I mean, it's clear that President Biden really feels that attachment to Israel in his kishkas, and he always talks so powerfully about his first meeting with Golda Meir back in the 1970s.
Right, and the magic weapon that we have nowhere else to go
but
and
to
all
say
of that.
that he's the first Zionist president?
I struggle to think of an American president, even I wouldn't even include Clinton in this, who in many respects was favorable to Israel in some ways. It wasn't in his kishkas the way that it's in Joe Biden's kishkas. He's really the old Democrat. He's the last of the Mohicans of that Democratic
and
generation.
for listeners who don't understand Yiddish, we mean guts when we say kishkas.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes. So look, the question is whether he's the first and whether he's genuinely a Zionist. I actually think he's deeply committed to Israel in an instinctive gut way, in a way that no other president has been. Other presidents have been supportive, there's no question. But I think he feels...
So what's the dilemma?
Well, okay, come back to that in a second. The dilemma is also, and I'll say, that I think by and large he's given Israel a very, very, very long leash. A lot of people say now he's held back on this and he hasn't been supportive on that. People, I think, forget that he's the president of the United States, not the president of the United States for Israel. And he's also the president of the United States who happens to be running for re-election. So we can't expect him to do exactly what we would want to do at every step of the way. And I would argue, and again, some of our listeners, your listeners may or may not agree with the following statement, but if you're the prime minister of the state of Israel and you consistently lie to the president of the United States, it's going to come and bite you at a certain point.
What specifically are you accusing the Prime Minister of lying about?
The Prime Minister has misled about Rafiah. He's misled about Israel's ultimate intentions. He's misled about whether or not he's willing to have a conversation about the day after.
What do you mean? I think the Prime Minister has been quite clear from day one that Israel's intentions are dismantling Hamas's governing and military capabilities, bringing back all the hostages, and making sure that Gaza can never pose a threat to Israel again.
Yeah, we all understand that that's a much easier said than done, and Israelis are talking about many different kinds of interim medial kinds of solutions or non-solutions, and Bibi's obviously not willing to have that conversation publicly because of the Ben Gvir and Smotrich factor and a variety of other factors among the Bibi crowd. He's treated Joe Biden basically as somebody that he thinks he can outfox and he can outmaneuver, and sometimes he can, but he can't always. And I think at a certain point, don't forget Joe Biden, you know this very well, but Joe Biden was obviously Barack Obama's vice president. Mm-hmm. Barack Obama and Bibi did not have a bromance, to put it very mildly. So there's a lot of leftover of Bibi kind of maneuvering things in a way that suits him. And I think there's a tremendous amount of resentment to that. And I can understand that. I don't necessarily agree with everything Biden's done, obviously. But I understand the resentment to Bibi and the Biden administration. Now, how many arms have really been held up, for example? Amos Hochstein said yesterday that it's a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs that were going to be used in urban areas. Other than that, nothing has been held up. Blinken said the same thing. So I don't personally know. I don't actually take the inventory at the airport. But assuming that these gentlemen are telling the truth, the United States has given Israel now an eight-month leash so far without calling for an absolute ceasefire, without withholding all the arms and so on and so forth. It has by and large supported Israel very strongly in the international community. There was a UN vote that disappointed Israelis, but again, I think there's a lot of factors for it. So American Jews who have to make a decision in November, I think, have to make a decision between a president who has been there pretty solidly for Israel, although not without limit, who's not going to send troops in, versus someone who says that he would solve this thing in a matter of days, and that if he had been president, this would never have happened in the first place, who might send in troops, but who also was the president who pulled out American troops out of Syria, which actually endangered Israel. So the Trump administration, if we can go way back when to the Trump administration, there were many ways in which he was, of course, supportive of Israel. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem was very important, and his statements on a variety of other issues were very important. He did a lot of the right things. But he didn't do all the right things either. People tend to forget that. Pulling American troops out of Syria endangered Israel directly. Ripping up the Iran agreement, at the end of the day, we'll know more years from now, but it either did help Israel or didn't help Israel. Iran is now unconstrained by any agreement with the United States. So no matter what it does in terms of enriching uranium, rebuilding a nuclear warhead and so forth, it's not in violation of a treaty because the United States ripped up the treaty. So American Jews are faced actually with a very, very, very difficult choice. I don't vote in America. I actually...
as a matter of principle?
As a matter of principle.
Why?
I moved here. I vote here. I obviously am an American citizen. I could vote there. I pay taxes, all of that. Feels to me...
You've earned that vote.
What's that?
You've earned that vote.
I've earned that vote, yeah, and I continue to earn that vote, unfortunately, at the IRS. But nonetheless, it feels to me that if one has thrown one's lot, and not everybody, my wife does vote in American elections. One or two of my kids do vote in American elections. Some of my kids don't vote in elections. So we don't all agree about it, and I don't think it's a matter of huge principle. It's not that I think that voting is terribly wrong. Most of my American expat friends who live here do vote. I just feel that I've thrown my lot in with this country. And as a result, it just feels to me a little bit off to be voting, even though I have an absolute moral and legal right to do so. I would also note that my residence is in California, so it makes absolutely no difference in any scenario having anything to do with any of the national vote.
And so in a sentence, the dilemma facing American Jews in November, as you see it?
The known of a Biden, who is been very supportive of Israel, but not unlimitedly supportive of Israel, versus the unknown of a Trump, who might be much more supportive of Israel, but might not, and who knows very little about how diplomacy is carried out and is a bit of a wild card, and therefore is a big joker in the hand of cards that were dealt. It's very hard to know where it would lead.
Interesting, because I asked you what you think the dilemmas are facing American Jews in November, and you immediately took it in the direction of foreign policy and where Biden and Trump would stand on Israel. But there are much deeper questions facing American Jews about how they keep themselves safe as a community, what their place is within American society, especially in the wake of October 7th and seeing how such large parts of the population, particularly progressive circles among young people, have turned on Israel. And that's also relevant to the question of how they vote in November. It's not a pure foreign policy question.
Well, why is it? I mean, I understand, I agree with you completely that that's a huge problem for American Jews. It's a painful, heartbreaking problem. But I don't understand how the presidential choice actually impacts on that.
Do you not think it does?
I'm not sure that it does. In other words, it's true that Biden is the head of a party which has a huge liberal, woke, even extreme in certain cases.
And now you're answering your own question about why this is a question about the American Jewish community and not just Israel, because whoever comes into power, there are questions about who are the other people that they are bringing into power with them. And what does that mean for the safety and security of the American Jewish community?
I think municipal government's going to mean a lot more to that. And I think that changing American citizens' views, whether they're on the right or on the left, is going to be not so much a result of political leadership in this party or that party, but a whole cultural, intellectual wave of changing American thought. Look, I think American Jews are facing a very dark time, and it's tragic, heartbreaking. There is anti-Semitism on the isolationist, America's white Christian right, and there is anti-Semitism on the left, using Israel's war with Gaza as an excuse, but not really motivated by that. It's been going on for a long time, and it's just kind of broken out. It's also funded by Iran and Qatar. We know all of that. So again, I think that American Jewish conundrum is very real, but I don't personally see how the presidential choice actually affects the position of American Jews on the ground. I think that if you're going to be an American college student for the next 10, 20 years, life is going to be very unpleasant. And I don't see any president that I can imagine doing very much about that in one direction or the other. I think if you are a synagogue goer, you're going to have more security around your synagogue than you've had in years, and probably for the foreseeable future. And I don't know that that changes whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So I think American Jews have a huge political decision to make when it comes to the presidency in Israel. When it comes to the place of American Jews in America, it's not so much a political issue as much as a cultural, intellectual, educational issue. And that's about rebuilding the universities. That's about rethinking a lot of the assumptions of the American left and the American right. And I don't see the presidential election having much impact on that.
So let's unpack that. Let's put the presidential election to one side and ask, what is it going to take for American Jewry, which has felt that it reached the golden Medina, right? The golden country where finally Jews were embraced and safe and accepted. And you see that with the assimilation rates within American society.
And in the marriage
well.
rates, which is the ultimate indicator of acceptance.
Exactly, specifically the marriage rates. Suddenly looking at America and finding themselves squeezed on both sides, fearful for the future of the community. And I'm wondering, this really is a bigger question about what it means to be Jewish at all in America. How are American Jews navigating that question, particularly post-October 7th?
And that's the America that I grew up in, right? I was born in the late 50s. I grew up in really the golden era of American Judaism. It was long enough after the Holocaust that the dust wasn't in the air anymore, but it was soon enough that it colored everything, and people didn't say things. Even people that didn't like Jews just knew you couldn't say it. Those days are long since gone. And the world that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, we got out of Vietnam, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union fell, AIDS came, but then we conquered AIDS, etc. It was a world in which it seemed that everything was moving and getting better for America in general, for the West in general, and for American Jews.
Progress.
So it seemed. My grandmother fled the Ukraine to come to the United States when she was a very young child around the turn of the 20th century.
Where in Ukraine?
A small little village not far from Kyiv. It appears every now and then on a CNN map these days, or it used to when the Western world was following that war. She fled right around the turn of the century as a very young girl. My memories of my Savta, as we called her, are sitting in my parents' backyard in suburban Baltimore, middle class, upper middle class, American family. My father was an academic at Johns Hopkins. My mom was doing doctoral work at the University of Maryland.
Okay, no need to show off.
No, I'm not trying to show off. My point is that we had made it completely. We felt completely American, and we never thought to ask my grandmother what it was like in the Ukraine, and she never spoke about it. In other words, the reason that I mentioned all that...
You had this omerta, this vow of silence where you would rather not know and she would rather not tell.
I think we felt we were living outside of history. In other words, that story that we told about Jewish history, that was what happened to those people there. It wasn't what... We were trans-historical. We were beyond history. Jewish history and its patterns for 2,000 years didn't touch us. And therefore, we were living in, as you said, the Golden Medina. And I think what American Jews are discovering now, and by the way, Israeli Jews are discovering as well, because we here told ourselves a very historical story, but was a historical story about victories. Yes, there were problems along the way, and the beginning days of the Yom Kippur War were terrible, and 1% of the Jewish population of the State of Israel died in the War of Independence, and all of that is true, but we fundamentally here in Israel told ourselves a story of victory after victory after victory, a little stumble, but victory after victory, and what we're stuck in now here is we don't know how to actually read what's going on now in terms of the story that we've told ourselves. And the United States also, I think American Jews are struggling with the fact that history came knocking at the door after all. That the history of American Jews is now looking like very much the history of Jews. That Jews on the left, people on the left who are not Jewish don't necessarily like Jews. People on the right who are not Jewish don't necessarily like Jews. There's people who will speak about Jews in positive ways, but when it comes to their careers, not do very much to protect them. The Jews of the United States are now living what the Jews of Europe have long lived with, and what the Jews before the Holocaust fled Europe to try to get away from. So I think it's not so much a question of how we keep ourselves safe, although that's obviously critical. We have to tell ourselves a whole new story about what it means to be a Jew. Meaning, to be a Jew cannot be just, what do you want to call it? I don't know, tikkun olam, or whatever phrase they want to use. Sort of, we're part of the liberal world that's trying to make the world a better place. And we're not that distinct or unique in any way. Because they think we're distinct and unique. And now the question is, do we have anything unique to say anymore?
I want to unpack that. You said, tikkun olam dismissively. And I want to understand actually how American Jews conceive of themselves. Because in Israel, it's very clear. Israelis regard themselves, they say, Jews are a nation. We are now a sovereign nation with a country, with borders, yet unresolved borders, but with borders, with an army, with a police force of our own. We are a state, and around the world there are scattered Jewish communities who belong to our nation that has reclaimed its sovereignty in its ancient land. But that's not really the story that American Jews are able to tell about themselves. In the lead up to October 7th, how would your, if one could say, typical American Jew understand what it meant to be an American Jew?
There's obviously not, it's not homogeneous.
Of course.
There's all different kinds of groups. But I would say that the vast majority of people, let's say my generation and one generation younger, are people who felt that Judaism was essentially a kind of a liberal politics. They never said it that way. And they would go to services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But fundamentally, the values of Judaism were the values that they saw when Jews aligned with the black community in the 1960s for the civil rights movement. The values of Judaism were the highest values, the highest of bringing in Jewish immigrants first, but then bringing in other immigrants along the way. The values were about equality among the sexes. The values were, in many cases, equality for gays and lesbians and that whole movement and so on and so forth. They would say that's the essence of what Judaism is. Now, my question to them always was, but that's also the essence of what liberal Christianity is. And that's also the essence of what liberal, non-religious American life is all about. So in what way is that actually different? And they would say, well, we do tikkun olam. Okay, so you have a Hebrew word for it. That's very nice.
Tikkun olam, of course, for those who don't speak Hebrew, we've already translated from Yiddish, repairing the world, the Jewish value of
That's very nice. It's a Jewish value, there's no question. But repairing the world is one of very many different Jewish things, many different Jewish ideas and values and commitments. And it's the one where actually the Jews are not all that different from anybody else. So I think that focusing our American Jewish identity as being about repairing the world and doing justice and so forth made us fundamentally indistinguishable from our liberal, Christian, and non-religious at all counterparts.
And yet, if they're experiencing an upsurge of anti-Semitism, it really hasn't made them indistinguishable, has it?
It's not made them indistinguishable, but now not by their own choice. In other words, they never sought to say, we're Jewish, and therefore here's where we actually disagree with the progressive world. We're Jewish, and here's where we actually have something unique and different to say. We're Jewish, and therefore we live in this particular way because this particular way of life is what has sustained us for 2,000 years. We never said any of those things. And that's the point that you're making is exactly the critical point. I think the question for American Jews is from the center and left, and the center is not 50%, right? The center is much more than that. But from the center and left, can we reimagine an American Jewishness which is deeply American, which is committed to many of those liberal values that it's always been to, but which takes its distinctiveness and its difference and its non-acceptance as being a badge of honor? And then the question is, can we raise children who can say something about where Judaism differed, what Judaism says that is different from everybody else, that would then justify putting up with what you're going to have to put up with? Because at the end of the day, if Judaism has nothing all that different to say from what a liberal, thoughtful, serious, intellectually engaged Protestant church has to say, leaving issues of Jesus and all of that out for a second, but if our fundamental values are exactly the same, why should I put up with this? Why should I live like this? Why, if I go to an American campus, should I not just not be me? Why should I just not fade into the woodwork and be an American student? And I think that's the critical question that American Jews are going to have. Since we're going to be singled out anyway, are we going to now stand for something that's different and unique?
That's an intriguing idea because the Jewish conception of justice has always been about standing up to the majority, saying, yes, sometimes the majority is wrong, and that is a perversion of justice, and we have the truth on our side, even if we're the lone voices screaming into the wilderness. And I'm intrigued that you think that having been othered after October 7th, American Jewry needs to become more particularistic. And then I'm wondering, what is that new story? What is that new narrative? In what ways do American Jews need to reimagine their community and say, okay, we can't blend into the woodwork, as you say, and become indistinguishable from all other Americans? We have been othered. History has come back. We're experiencing what Jews have experienced in the past in terms of discrimination, I would say persecution as well, especially in academic circles. Where do you see this going, and do you think that American Jewry has the necessary leadership to go about this very sharp course correction and first of all, even do the basic introspection to ask where things went wrong?
It's a very good question. I don't think the answer to that is clear yet. In other words, I think just as in Israel, it's not clear to us, have we transcended the toxicity of what we call October 6th, right? The pre-October 7th toxicity that had Israel in its grips. Israelis are asking, did we as a society learn anything from 2023, January through September? I think the question, that's a very open question. I think a lot of people desperately want us to be different, and a lot of people are very comfortable being exactly as we were, and we don't yet know what it's going to look like when we look back 10, 15 years from now as to whether or not something dramatic changed in Israel. Now, going back to, go ahead.
No, but it's a question of how American Jews conceive of their relationship with Israel. Is Israel this country across the sea to which I don't necessarily have any connection? Yes, maybe some religious or cultural attachments, but that's Israel, that's a different country, and I'm an American. Or do they regard themselves not as Israeli expats, but as prepats, right, as being intrinsically culturally linked to Israel, that Israel is a source of modern Jewish identity, and that it's not just some random country across the seas to which they may have some very distant ancestral connection? Do you see a movement in America that is reconnecting with Israel as a source of meaning and identity?
I hear individual voices. I hear individual liberal rabbis saying, Israel's not just another country across the ocean. Because if American history right now proves anything, it proves that the Jewish people needs a country of its own. It needs a place to call home. It needs a place where it can be the determinant of its own destiny. And if we felt comfortable...
And that place isn't Tenafly, New Jersey.
It's not Tenafly, New Jersey, and it's not Teaneck, New Jersey, and it's not Los Angeles, and it's not anywhere else. Because all those places are all feeling exactly the same thing. I think there are people on the left who have had tremendous courage. Because it takes tremendous courage as a rabbi who's been around for a very long time and who's built a reputation on a certain worldview to say in front of a camera or in front of a congregation, I was wrong. I built the last 20, 30 years of my career on an assumption about Judaism and Jewish history, which proved to be incorrect. There are people that are saying that, and I think they're very courageous. There are many others who are trying to kind of re-wrap the old goods in new wrapping paper. It's not going to work, and I think it's actually kind of cowardly, but I understand where it comes from. Those people who've built a reputation. But let me just say, I think that for American Jews, one dramatic change is going to have to be, can they embrace the particularism that being a Zionist means? Can they embrace the idea that this state matters? It's not going to do exactly what they want. It doesn't do what most Israelis want. Can they embrace a country that is flawed, that is in a very difficult situation, that is in a horrible region and so forth, and say, hell or high water, I now understand that the Jewish people needs a home. And I'm going to support that state and its right to exist against the majority, as you said before.
But it can't just be that. It can't just be regarding Israel as that refugee camp on the Mediterranean where we'll go if things spin out of control.
But I didn't say that. I didn't say refugee camp where we would go.
No, but not just a place that is our home where we can go if things go wrong. I'm wondering on a much deeper level of identity. Professor Yossi Shein from Tel Aviv University writes about this in his book, The Israeli Century. The English is my translation of the original Hebrew. He talks about a process of what he calls the Israelization of Judaism. That Jewish food is no longer smoked salmon bagels, it's shakshuka and sabich and falafel. And that Jewish music isn't, klezmer, it's increasingly Omer Adam and Ivri Lida. And that Israeli culture is coming to define what Jewish culture is more broadly, and more than that, that for the anti-Zionist Jews as well, those who don't want anything to do with Israel, they're increasingly defining their Jewish identity through their opposition to Israel. Even they are not able to disconnect from it. They see it as a source of meaning, but as a source of anti-meaning. And I'm wondering whether you connect with that and whether you think that there is a process within American Jewish society, not of regarding, wow, on a philosophical level, I understand the importance that the Jews should have a state, but to which they feel intrinsically culturally linked to Israel as a cultural font, as the center of the Jewish universe.
I don't think they know who Ivri Leader is. And I don't think they've ever heard of Yishai Ribo. And I doubt if they know who the Banai brothers are. In other words, I think that
they're missing out on a lot.
They're missing out on a lot. And we're missing out a lot, I guess, on other artists there. But I think that thesis, that the Israeli century thesis, is a fascinating thesis. It's a fascinating book. But I don't think it characterizes most of American Jewry, which is very, very, very distant from Israel and doesn't know a tremendous amount about it. Knows about, Bibi Netanyahu, can maybe mention a few other places, people, but it's been very distant. And I think that the challenge for American Jews now is going to be, can we actually reconceive of ourselves as a people that has a homeland of which we are in which we're kind of in an ongoing relationship, a meaningful relationship of trying to learn maybe even its language, and learning more about its history, and learn more about the people that shape it. And I don't mean Bibi Netanyahu or Benny Gantz, but I mean artists and writers and so on and so forth. I think that's a huge challenge. And you asked, do we have the leaders? In my old life, I was the dean of a rabbinical school on the West Coast. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in that rabbinical school was make it very Israel-centric. Aliyah wasn't on our radar screen. We were planning to stay in America for the long haul. But it was very important to me that Israel be deeply affected by, or that they be deeply affected by Israel, and there be, when the story of Nachshon Wachsman happened, Nachshon Wachsman, just for our viewers, is a soldier who was captured by Palestinian terrorists, and the Israeli elite forces tried to rescue him. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and he was killed, some other soldiers were killed, and it was a disaster, basically.
And a reminder, by the way, in the context of the present war with Gaza, of just how dangerous and risky these heroic hostage rescue missions are. We're recording this not long after the heroic rescue of the 4 hostages, including Noah Argamani, and Israeli forces take huge, tremendous risks in being heroes and going into safe hostages.
Right. the day or two after what happened with Nachshon Wachsman happened, it was in the mid-90s, if I remember correctly, I taught something about Israel, just in his memory. It wasn't about him, it wasn't about the rescue effort, it wasn't a military thing, I just taught something. And I remember that we disbanded afterwards, so the rabbinical students were all there, and we moved on to this gigantic terrace that we had at the school there. And a couple of students came up to me and said, what does that have to do with us? And I
literally the question that the wicked son asks at the Passover table.
Exactly. And I think that was the beginning of our Aliyah. I really do think so. I think that I look back and I said, when they don't even understand, you can agree with this or that, but you don't want to study some Torah in memory of Nachshon Wachsman, who was just murdered after Israeli soldiers tried to save him. And you come up and you say, well, what's that got to do with us? I think that the rabbinical schools, that's the norm in the rabbinical school more and more. In other words, I have spoken to many rabbinical students at HUC and JTS and Ziegler School in LA and other places as well who say that to be an unabashed Zionist in rabbinical school is a lonely road. It's a lonely road to hoe. People say, I just don't know what to do. Because if I'm unabashedly embracing of Israel, I'm the outsider in my rabbinical school class. Now, if that's the case, and I have no reason to think that they're misrepresenting anything, if that's the case, and there was just a story that came out about the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia where students said exactly that, it made the press very briefly, then who's producing the leaders? Who's going to produce the leaders who are going to enable American Jews to say, we have to really press the equivalent of Control-Alt-Delete. We have to reboot this thing. We're going to have to actually ask ourselves if our last 50 years of American Jewish life was built on, first of all, the notion that in American life, we transcend Jewish history. The waves and tribulations of Jewish history that we read about in those history books, they don't touch us because America is a different kind of a place. That's not so true anymore. And number two, what we're going to be about is going to be about bringing Jewish conceptions of justice to the world. The world does not need the Jews to bring those Jewish conceptions of justice because they've been embraced by Christians, they've been embraced by non-religious people of all sorts. So the question is, are there going to be rabbis and other communal leaders out there who are going to say, we have to rethink this whole thing?
This is really disturbing what you're saying here, because we know that there is a generational drift away from Israel. And we have a poll here from the Pew Research Center, published middle of February, that compares the number of Jewish Americans who say the way that Israel is carrying out its response to the October 7th massacre is large numbers saying unacceptable. A majority, even among young adults, 18 to 34, 52% say the way Israel is carrying out its response is acceptable, but 42% are saying unacceptable. Much smaller numbers among older generations. There was a separate poll from the National Survey of Jewish Votes that found that nearly half of American Jews in that age bracket think that Biden has been too supportive of Israel. And what you are telling me now is that it might not be despite that generation's leadership, but precisely because of it. And that the young American Jewish rabbis are in fact leading this process of alienation away from Israel and therefore the global Jewish collective. I mean, to me, it sounds like a fundamental rejection of the basic principle of global Jewish solidarity, of global Jewish family. How did we get here?
How did we get there? Look, Stephen Cohen, who is an American Jewish sociologist of some import, published a study, I think it probably goes back 15 years ago, but what he also, this was long before October 7th and long before Joe Biden was president, he asked Jews, if the state of Israel were to be destroyed, that would be for me a personal catastrophe. And what he showed was that the older generation, 80% of American Jews who were 70 years and older, 60 and older, said yes, if Israel was destroyed, that would be a personal catastrophe. But by the time you got down to Jews in their 30s and their 20s, half said no, it wouldn't be. I would like it not to happen. But if Israel were to be destroyed, it's not going to be a personal catastrophe for me. This goes back a decade and a half at least, maybe 2 decades. So this is not new. American Jews have been formulating a kind of Judaism which was, I think, largely separated from the larger global Jewish body politic, as you're putting it. And I think now the hens have come home to roost, as they say.
No, but that's really horrific, because it's not just a question of Israel as a separate sovereign state. If you'd asked American Jews in the 1930s, would it be a tragedy if Polish Jewry were destroyed, as ultimately it was? I would hope that they would say absolutely, because sovereign state, not sovereign state, it is a Jewish community, it is a Jewish collective, and therefore it is a tragedy for the global Jewish world if part of it, nearly half of it in the case of Israel, were destroyed. How did we get to this situation in which the leadership of the Jewish community among the young generation is finding itself leading the charge against Israel? Are these people, are they reacting to particular social pressure that they feel they need to throw Israel under the bus to gain acceptance in wider American society?
I'll come back to that in one second. I just want to point out that even during the Holocaust, how many protests, how many national protests were there of Jews in Washington that would do something about the Holocaust?
None.
None. So yes, they would have said the destruction of Polish Jewry would have been a terrible thing, and
so you have to understand this in the context then, not of alienation from Israel specifically.
Alienation from history.
But alienation from history and from the broader Jewish collective, and seeing Jewish life outside of America as not being relevant to the question of what it means to be a Jew in America. And that has to change. Whatever form that takes, that has to change.
Correct. And we're talking about something that happened 85 years ago, almost a century ago. This has been going on for a very long time. But young American rabbis, the ones who are going to rabbinical school now, are the products of the same exact American campuses that young Democratic left-wing voters are a product of. Their universalism is a priority. Particularism is perceived as problematic. The entire world, as you well know, is seen through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, powerful and powerless, and so on and so forth.
And when you adopt that narrative, you leave Jews with an impossible decision of either claiming to be oppressed and crying about how much you are oppressed, or constantly beating yourself up for how much you are an oppressor and trying to atone for that and doing Hashem Bagadnu all year round.
Exactly. That's the impossible situation that they find themselves in, which is why I don't see it as a political issue. To go back to the beginning of our conversation, I don't think that the presidential election bears on this existential Jewish question. American Jews have to reinvent the whole enterprise. Now, there's an orthodoxy which has been very distinctive and particularist, which is not universalist, and which has been very attached to Israel. There are non-Orthodox Jews for whom Israel engagement, AIPAC, and other organizations has been the core pillar of their life, and they have something distinct to say. But if you add all of those up, the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox Israel supporters and so on and so forth, I don't know what it comes to, 30%, 35%. It's not half, that's for sure. So somewhere between a half and 2/3 of American Judaism have embraced a notion of history in which the the running river of Jewish history is not the river in which we're floating. And the global Jewish community is out there. It's not us. We're part of something very different. And we share this notion of the world as oppressor and oppressed and powerful and powerless. And we don't even know how to begin to articulate a different worldview.
And I mean, that's especially disturbing when you consider not only this generational rift, but especially on college campuses, you see, and the protesters are very proud about this, that the Jewish anti-Zionists are overrepresented as a portion of the Jewish world in these protests against Israel, seem to derive their Jewish identity from being anti-Israel and hostile to Israel. And I'm wondering, do you think that the choice now, after October 7th, is between a Jewish world that is increasingly coming closer together after a realization of how small we are, how vulnerable we are, or a historic schism within the Jewish world, in which there is ultimately a split between two fundamentally irreconcilable Jewish worlds, a Zionist world that is committed to the welfare and security of the state of Israel, and a group that has decided to join our worst enemies in calling for the destruction of the Jewish state.
Well, that's where we're at. I mean, I think that we're already there. There's going to be some people in the middle who are now going to have to make a decision. And I think we're seeing that some of them are actually having a wake-up call and saying, well, Jewish history is actually more complex. I'm moving back towards, let's say, where my parents or grandparents
were. And for those people, what should they do about the anti-Zionist extremes that, in the name of their Judaism, no less, are trying to throw half of the world's Jews to the wolves by demanding, from the river to the sea, Tel Aviv has to fall under Hamas supremacy?
Right. I don't know how many of those people can be changed. I really don't. I don't know how deeply held these views are. I don't know how much a decent book about Israeli history would actually begin to loosen them up. What I do know is this, that a Judaism that is predicated on anti-Zionism. We saw ads just a few months ago for anti-Zionist seders. A Passover seder, anti-Zionist. In the Northwest, in the Bay Area, I remember one of them came out.
So that Moses can lead the Hebrews to the promised land of Brooklyn.
I don't even know exactly where the story
skip the Holy Land in the middle.
It may shock you I didn't make it to that Seder, so I don't know exactly what they said. But look, you can't build a Jewish life on about being opposed to something. Jewish life has to be built on being embracing of something, a world-changing idea. What Zionism is a world-changing idea. The idea of Torah and of Jewish observance is a world-changing idea. The idea of Jewish particularity in lots of other ways is a world-changing idea. Those people are trying to build a Judaism that's basically the fundamental foundation of it is critique of Israel and separating themselves from Israel. Why would anybody want to join that? They're basically just expressing the little bit of Jewish passion that they have from their parents and their grandparents. But why would their children want to be part of it at all? What's the point of joining something to be against something else?
But I'm wondering, as part of the broader Jewish collective, what do you do about these Jews who are anti-Israel, who are siding with the Jewish people's worst enemies? Does the Jewish community need to say, you know what, we're going to excommunicate you, you can't marry in our synagogues, you can't get buried in our graveyards. If you go out protesting for people who are murdering Jews, it's over, we don't see you as being Jews anymore? Or is there something to fight for in bringing them into the fold and making this case to them that actually a Judaism based on hostility to the Jewish collective, on destroying, on being anti, is not sustainable, and trying to appeal to their better angels in that sense?
Well, there's no American Judaism in which people say to them, you can't get buried here, you can't get married here. American Judaism has failed to set those limits with all kinds of other issues. There's no issue that there's nothing that you can do in America, including murdering people or whatever else, that's going to say that somebody's going to say you can't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. That's just not going to happen. And they're not going to not let people become members of synagogues. The tent is very wide and it's very broad. Maybe their organizations won't be part of the National Conference of...
I'm asking, is that tent too wide? Is it time to roll down the shutters?
I'm not sure what good that does. I think what we have to try to do is make a case for a passionate, Jewish, culturally rich, intellectually rich, democratic Jewish state as a center of the Jewish world.
And this is a debate that is taking place within progressive circles as well about how you adapt. We have a clip here that really caught my eye from a Twitter that I saw of Rabbi Ami Hirsch, a senior rabbi at the Free Synagogue, making this case about what you do about understanding the role of Israel within the Jewish world, and particularly the centrality of Israel. The Reform movement historically was anti-Zionist and opposed to Israel. They did an about turn, not completely, but let's have a look at what Rabbi Hirsch has to say.
Is it conceivable that we would be ordaining anti-Zionists to lead our congregations in the future? Is there a future for such a movement? Let us stand for the principles we stated and restated since the mid-20th century. We are a Zionist movement. We are committed to the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. We are theologically, philosophically, and practically devoted to the Jewish state, not uncritically, but unconditionally.
Is this sentiment reflective of progressive Jewish opinion in the United States, or is he a lone voice?
He is an outlier. He is a courageous, noble, extraordinary person who is an outlier. When he asks, is it conceivable that we would ordain anti-Zionist rabbis? Why is he asking that question? Because he knows they're ordaining anti-Zionist rabbis, and it's not only the Reform movement. You see it a lot in the conservative movement as well. You see it, I know, because we just talked about it before, in the Reconstructionist movement. This is everywhere else. It's actually, by the way, infiltrated Orthodoxy to a certain extent, a very small degree, but it's really an outlier movement. But the vast majority of Jews in America who are being ordained as rabbis are at the very best tepid about Israel, and many of them are openly hostile.
And you've had personal experience of this because you were ordained as a rabbi with the conservative Jewish movement, which you no longer identify with. Do I have that correct?
I dropped out of the Rabbinical Association.
Why?
Because there were people that were talking about Israel committing genocide. This was after October 7th. And people said, and I was just like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? In what world is what you're seeing genocide? And I always say to my colleagues, in what world is it okay for colleagues to say that and not to be roundly criticized? In other words, somebody has said, African Americans should not be able to go to an Ivy League college. The whole movement would have pounced on them.
They would have been screamed out of the room.
Correct. If somebody had said, I don't know, gays and lesbians should not be able to join conservative synagogues, completely out of the question, it would have created a ruckus. People are literally saying on all of the various communication networks that the Rabbinical Assembly had, Israel's committing genocide. Not tons of them, but enough of them that it was a real issue. The leaders of this movement called Truah, which is a rabbinic movement that is supposedly in favor of a much more liberal Israel, but is practically lambasting Israel at every turn. The leadership of that movement is largely from the conservative movement. So at a certain point, I just felt if they have a right to say what they want, but the movement also has a right to kind of say no. You can say what you want, but we stand for something very different. But nobody had the courage of their convictions. So I just dropped out. I couldn't have my son fighting in the North and me being on the roster of an organization that said the army that he's fighting in is committing genocide.
How is he doing, by the way?
He's out now. He's okay. He's probably, like all of them, going to go back in. And we're worried. He's worried. You know, this is a different story altogether, but it's not like he was when he was in Sadi or the regular army. He's married, he's got kids, it's a whole different ballgame. And
a tangent, but important nonetheless, because it anchors us and reminds us where we are and the context we're speaking in.
And I couldn't both have him in uniform in the North and have supposed colleagues who are saying Israel's committing genocide. I had to side with him or them, and I got out.
Dr. Gordis, I care very deeply about strengthening the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, helping to step up the diaspora awakening that we are seeing now and leverage that momentum to deepen the connections within our global Jewish family. And I've always been saying that one of the things Israel needs to do to strengthen its own position in relation to the diaspora is not to give them better sound bites or messages. That they can get from the citizen spokesperson's office. What Israel needs to do is to really strengthen their feeling that Israel is their home away from home, as President Herzog says, that they have a deep cultural, personal, emotional affiliation with Israel, and that Israel truly respects them and appreciates them and hears them. And that's exactly the message we heard from Israel's President Herzog just a few months ago in a special message that he released to the diaspora. Let's watch a clip.
In the face of this terrifying resurgence of anti-Semitism, do not fear, stand proud, stand strong for your freedom. Israel stands with you. Israel cares for you. We care for you. We are here for you. We will know better times ahead, and together we will say, Am Israel Chai.
Israel stands for you, stands with you. Israel is here for you and cares about you. Is that how American Jews feel that Israel treats them? Or do you think that actually, in terms of how Israel perceives itself as a Jewish and democratic state, its obligations towards the diaspora, the way that it respects and treats progressive forms of Jewish identity, Israel actually has changes that it needs to make in order to live true to this message from President Herzog that we really see you and feel you and appreciate you?
Look, a non-Orthodox rabbi in Israel cannot perform a wedding that's going to be registered with the rabbinate. So Reform conservative rabbis can perform weddings all they want, and those couples, and they do. And those couples just don't get registered with the rabbinate. And by the way, many regular Israelis who don't care about Reform or conservative Judaism don't register with the rabbinate anyway because they find the whole thing so appalling in so many ways. But for an American Jew they may have no intention of getting married in Israel. They may have no intention of having their kid get married in Israel. But when they hear that if their rabbi were to get on the plane and come to Israel to marry a couple in Israel, that wedding would not be considered official enough to be recognized by the rabbinate, they're appalled. By the way, because also in addition to everything else, anybody can perform a wedding in Jewish law. You don't need to be a rabbi or anything of the sort. There's the agreement at the Kotel, the Western Wall, that would have allowed for alternate kinds of prayer, which was basically...
And created a new permanent plaza.
Correct, which was then allowed to be overrun by ultra-Orthodox protesters and was not protected. And it's an agreement that Bibi backed down from, and so on and so forth. How many of those American Jews actually want to go there and pray? Probably very, very small number. But they see that as symbolic. And they say, we represent a form of Jewish life that nobody there wants to hear about or cares about or does anything to support.
Do you think that if Israel were to formally inaugurate an egalitarian, pluralistic plaza at the Western Wall and allow Reform and conservative rabbis to perform weddings in Israel, and make it easier to convert and receive recognition through the progressive movements, that these steps would make a meaningful difference to American Jewish support for Israel, or are we barking up the wrong tree?
It would make a meaningful difference to a group that's on the fence. It's not going to change those who are to the left of the fence. There are some people in the middle who really struggle with this. On so many occasions, I've actually met people who are American, Canadian, or whatever, who converted with a Reform rabbi, whoever in that. They have no interest in coming to Israel to live. It doesn't make one difference in their life that the rabbinate here doesn't recognize them as Jews. But I can't tell you, there's been a half a dozen occasions when people have been talking to me about it, they've burst into tears. And I go back to my hotel room after giving a talk somewhere and I'd say, what were they exactly crying about? I mean, it's very moving in a certain kind of way. It doesn't make any difference. The rabbinate here has no impact on their life, but they feel shunted aside. I'm not saying that Israel should, by the way, accept every single conversion out. There's got to be some meaningful accepted standard of conversion.
But if Israel endorses...
If it made some statements and that made it clear that it was trying to embrace other forms of Jewish life, it would help. It would definitely help. I think it would help more in the older generation than the younger generation. Religious issues are more an issue for the older generation. Political issues are more an issue for the younger generation. But it would help. It would also, by the way, be the right thing to do, which sometimes is a reason to do something. But you have a world in which we have chief rabbis here who are not Zionists, to say nothing of that they have never met probably or spoken to a Reform or conservative
And
Jew.
here's something they have in common with many Reform rabbis in the United States.
Well, there's a good way of putting a positive spin on it. But
we have so much that we can unite over and bring our rabbis together. I want to play a game with you. Israel comes under so much criticism. Some of that criticism is, of course, absolutely fair, and no one is a bigger critic of Israel than Israel's own citizens. Sometimes that criticism really crosses a line into demonization, dehumanization, or sometimes it's completely off the rails. So I want to throw a couple of examples and ask you whether you think that this criticism is kosher or not kosher. You will be our rabbinic authority. First example we have is, in this game of is this kosher? The first example that we have, that flying pig is definitely not kosher, the challah probably is. Your own open letter to American Jews, published in February 2023, together with Yossi Kleiner Levy and with Mati Friedman, in which you wrote warning of an existential threat to Israeli democracy and the long-term viability of the Jewish state. This was at the time of the massive protests against the planned judicial reform in Israel. You wrote, 6 months later, after your original letter, our worst fears are being realized. February 2023, you had no idea how bad your fears for 2023 could get. You wrote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition with the extreme right and the ultra-Orthodox parties signals nothing less than the end of the liberal state of Israel. Kosher or unkosher?
Kosher.
Kosher? Why kosher?
Because we were right. We were right. In other words, I think that extreme right-wing party, coalition now, is not willing to draft Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews. I mean, there are things that need to be done to save this country. Forget this country as a liberal country. Just this country as a sovereign state that he's simply not willing to do. We understood way back when, in the early part of the protests, that even if there was room for judicial reform, which there clearly was, and even if it was the right thing to do in certain ways, a genuine leader of Israel would have said to his counterparts, look, we're committed to this, and this is the right thing to do, but the country's hemorrhaging. And the first thing we have to do is bring the country together, because we care about the country more than our political agenda. And what we wrote in the second letter in particular was that is not what Bibi Netanyahu was all about. And we can see that now even more. We see now just a coalition which is unwilling to take difficult steps because he's afraid of losing his coalition, obviously with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, to draft the Haredim, to have a different kind of a conversation, an open conversation with Israelis about what's going to happen in Gaza the day after, if there ever is a day after. There's all sorts of things that prove that what we said back then was exactly kosher. It's a coalition and a government that cares about its own self-perpetuation. I say this with a broken heart, much more than it cares about the state that it's supposed to represent.
So, Rabbi Gordis, there we have an example for those who are watching and wondering, how do I criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic? That is how you regard a form of criticism of Israel, the Israeli government, that you regard as being kosher. An easy question, because I started you off asking you to justify your own remarks.
Okay.
Let's move on to some slightly trickier examples. We have here a quote from Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Truah, the coalition of so-called liberal rabbis, you referred to them earlier, in which she writes, collective punishment is a violation of international law. We echo the many family members of victims of Hamas's attack who, even in their grief, are calling for the Israeli government to de-escalate and prioritize the safe return of the hostages, as well as humanitarian relief for civilians in Gaza, knowing that seeking revenge will only result in more innocent lives lost and more families in mourning. This allegation that Israel is operating not to destroy Hamas and bring back the hostages, but acting out of this Old Testament bloodlust and thirst for revenge. Kosher or unkosher?
I think it's wrong. I think it's factually wrong. I don't think Israel's acting out of revenge.
Go on.
I think we understood that we made a terrible, grievous mistake. We, being all the echelons and all of Israeli society for probably a decade and a half at least, and thinking that we could control Hamas and thinking that we could live alongside it. And we understood all of a sudden that as long as they live to our south and Hezbollah lives to our north, we are abdicating, we're giving up huge swaths of Israeli territory by not being able to have citizens there.
And notice how this criticism is something we hear not only from liberal rabbis, you hear it from the government of Ireland as well when they say it looks like Israel is acting out of revenge. And you hear there the hints of the theological debate about how Christianity is all about compassion and forgiveness. But until the Lord Jesus Christ revealed himself, the Jews were all about a much more vengeful form of retribution.
Correct, and it's ironic that it comes from Ireland, which was so able and adept to solve political crises without violence and so on and so forth. But leaving that aside, this is actually a tame quote from Jill Jacobs. I mean, if you take the whole corpus of Jill Jacobs post-October 7th, it is unrelentingly, unremittingly critical of Israel, focusing much more on the...
And criticism may be kosher, so what's unkosher about this?
To focus more on the Gazan victims than on the Jewish victims, to not talk at all about the need for a Jewish sovereign state to be able to eradicate its enemies so it can survive for the next 75 years. That's just, how are you a leader of the Jewish people if nowhere in your sentiment is there a sense that, first and foremost, the Jewish state has to be able to protect itself and survive and protect its citizens? That's number one. How we go about it is something that we can talk about, but she never says that.
That's a tame example from Rabbi Jill Jacobs, but she's a tame example compared to our next provider of what I'll leave it as an open question whether it's kosher or treif, from Jewish Voice for Peace. Neither Jewish, not much of a voice for peace. Right. The group, of course, that famously did one of the seders in the encampments with all the Hebrew words spelt backwards
because they don't know how to read Hebrew,
because they don't know how to read Hebrew or know which direction it's spelled. Jewish Voice for Peace, which really, really has been the American branch of Hamas's propaganda efforts. There's no other way to put it. The acceleration of the Israeli military's genocide of Palestinians was on full display today as Israeli soldiers and drones massacred hundreds of Palestinians in the Nusayrat refugee camp in Gaza, supported and enabled by the US government. And for those who don't understand the context, when they say massacred hundreds of Palestinians in the Nusayrat refugee camp, what they mean is perform the most heroic hostage rescue mission in the history of the world to save 4 hostages from Hamas captivity, and then the rescue teams shot back when they came under fire because Hamas tried to shoot at the runaway hostages to keep them as slaves because the rescue teams have a right not to die, kosher or unkosher.
But what do you think I'm going to say?
I don't know. I'm in suspense.
Obviously not kosher, but it's just so sickening. The Jewish Voice for Peace is not a particularly Jewish group.
Who are they?
They are left-wing, progressive radicals who have decided to don the cloak of Jewishness as a way of making it seem that this is a legitimate position vis-a-vis Israel because Jews are saying it. Some of the leaders are Jews, most of the participants are not Jews, but it has been for decades already relentlessly critical of Israel, and they say explicitly that they don't care if a Jewish state...
It's not just critical, it's hostile.
They don't care if a Jewish state exists. They say that quite...
In fact, they would rather prefer it
does not exist. So at that point, you're just an enemy of the Jewish people, because if you're an enemy of the Jewish state, if you believe the Jewish state should not exist, then you are, it seems to me, an enemy of the Jewish people, since the Jewish state is part of guaranteeing the future of the Jewish people.
So this is very, very treifus. Treif is a pork sandwich with extra cheese on it. Let's have a look at the next example, a little bit more subtle, from Nadav Tamir, the head of J Street Israel, writing in the Jerusalem Post. He writes, the current disagreements, unlike past ones, are not just between right and left, but more between those who would stand behind any decision made by the Israeli government and those who would allow its decisions to be criticized. The actions and policies of Benjamin Netanyahu's fully right-wing government and its ingratitude towards US President Joe Biden, the most Zionist American president in the history of the US-Israel relationship, have garnered criticism even among those who used to believe that any such criticism endangers Israel. Kosher or unkosher?
It's not kosher, only because it's not as egregious as some of the other ones. But it's...
I mean, you seem to share much of the same sentiment of being critical of the Prime Minister Netanyahu's government.
It's missing, you know, we said Yiddish before, the geschmack. It's missing that fundamental taste of...
You'll have to tell me what geschmack means, because I'm Sephardi, so I don't... My Yiddish is not as polished as yours.
Fundamental taste or instinct that first and foremost, the Jewish state has to survive. even among Israelis now who are just debating, whether Bibi this, Bibi that. The fundamental question is, how do we survive this? Political questions are very important, but they're not the number one questions. I still get emails from American Jews writing me now, Bibi this, Bibi that. And I want to write back, of course, I'm opposed to a lot of things this coalition is doing, and I think we should have elections much sooner than we're likely to have them and so forth. But having said that, pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi is not the top of my agenda right now. My agenda is, how do we survive as a Jewish state? Are we going to be able to hold on to the North? Are we going to be able to hold on to the South? Are we going to have to keep young men and women in uniform in battle for years on end? That's where my heart's breaking over. And if your issue is now about Biden and criticizing this and criticizing that, you're missing the major melody of the song that's being sung right now. And I think that's always been part of the problem of the progressive left that wants to show it's committed to Israel in certain ways and groups that are. And I think Jewry genuinely believes that they are committed to Israel. Although, for example, it's not so clear, by the way. I mean, a guy named Daniel Levy, who's one of the founders of Jewry, said, if Israel's always going to be at war, he's on record as this, if Israel's always going to be at war, then creating a Jewish state wasn't a very good idea, was it? Well, no, it actually was. It was a great idea because it's transformed the Jewish people and it's given new life and birth to Jewish culture and literature and so forth. And if we have to be at war
in order to survive and not be genocided in one go.
Correct, then that is a terrible price to pay, but it doesn't become anywhere near like saying that it wasn't a good idea. It was a great idea, hundreds of years overdue. And now our job as Jews is to defend it and make sure it survives, no matter what our political stripes, no matter what our religious stripes. And if political issues and religious issues trump the issue of Israel's survival, at a time when Israel is really facing existential threats, then you're just not part of the same core of Jews that I feel myself part of, which includes Israelis and non-Israelis and observant Jews and non-observant Jews and left-wing Jews and right-wing Jews and all of that. We're all in this together because we understand that this is the critical question facing the Jewish people. And if criticizing Joe Biden a little bit more or a little bit less keeps you up at night, I think you're up at night about the wrong thing.
The next example of kosher or not kosher comes to us from Senator Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, who gave a speech on the floor of the US Senate that really raised some eyebrows here in Israel. He wrote, "Israel's a democracy. 5 months into this conflict, it's clear that Israelis need to take stock of the situation and ask, must we change course? At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel, at a time when so many Israelis have lost their confidence in the vision and direction of their government." He made it clear that he was speaking not only as a United States senator, but as an American Jew, kosher or not kosher for a foreign government official to intervene in the domestic politics and the schedule of when we in Israel should have our next election.
Obviously not kosher. You can't have Chuck Schumer criticizing Bibi for going to speak to a joint session of Congress and Obama because it was meddling in American politics, and have the very same Chuck Schumer saying to Israelis it's time to throw out your prime minister and have an election. Look, Chuck Schumer has by and large been very supportive of Israel over the years. If I had $1 for every time I've heard him say in person that Schumer comes from Shomer, Guardian, I'd be a philanthropist. So his heart is basically in the right place. He was trying to help Biden out. Here it's an election year. He's a well-known established senator. He was trying to show people in America that even American Jewish Democrats and so forth are supportive of Biden and don't necessarily like what Bibi's doing. The great irony, of course, is that it strengthened Bibi. There's nothing that Israelis like less than seeing somebody outside telling them how they should vote. So ironically, Chuck Schumer, in trying to boost the forces pushing for elections, actually gave Bibi a lot of energy that week or two.
Okay, and our final round of kosher or not kosher comes from the former and perhaps future president of the United States, Donald Trump, who said any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion. They hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves because Israel will be destroyed.
Well, it's certainly classic Trump. It's ludicrous. It's not kosher. There are going to be many Jews who care deeply about Israel and care deeply about the Jewish state and are very proud of being Jewish and who love their tradition, who are going to vote for Joe Biden, either because they think it's good for the American judiciary or the American electorate or the American rule of law or whatever, or they may think actually that, again, one can debate it, but they will say that the Jewish state is better off having an American president who knows how diplomacy is conducted, rather than having a person who just decides one day he's going to do this or do that and doesn't follow the normal channels of diplomacy, because that won't, in the end of the day, help Israel. So I can understand Jews are voting this way. I can understand Jews are voting that way. I have a particular personal preference, which we won't go into right now. But to say that anybody who votes for Joe Biden hates Israel and hates their religion and wants Israel to be destroyed is, of course, ludicrous.
Okay, Dr. Gordis, this has been a fascinating discussion about the challenges facing American Jewry, not just in an election year, but as we feel the riptides of history returning to American Jewry, reminding them that they exist in a world in which Jewish history hasn't gone away, and unfortunately they will face many of the dilemmas as their ancestors in a different world, a world in which the Jews have their own sovereign state, and a question about how you navigate those choppy waters in a world in which the Jews have their own ship of state. Dr. Gordis, how can people follow you and your work?
I put out a blog and a podcast called Israel from the Inside. It's on Substack. So you can go onto substack.com and just search for Gordis or Israel from the Inside. We put out a few columns a week and a podcast, at least one podcast a week. And we'd be delighted for them to follow me and delighted for them to follow you even more.
Okay, Dr. Gordis, thank you very much for joining us here on State of a Nation.
Pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of State of a Nation with Dr. Daniel Gordis. As always, please follow and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow us on all the social media platforms, on Twitter, on Instagram, all the others. We'll be back soon with more episodes taking us beyond the headlines and between the lines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.